And the last thing I want to talk about, the last period, is contact improvisation. Historically, the newest sort of subgenre of contemporary dance, and it came into to being in 1972 during the period, or sort of at the end of the period of radicalization that included the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam movement, and struggles for women's liberation and gay and lesbian liberation. And this last development was in a period in dance called postmodern, the postmodern period, started in the 1950s. And this was kind of the last part of that. And I am actually skipping over huge pieces of history by not talking about that whole period, which actually did involve many Canadian groups. And I don't know if anybody in the room can speak about that today, but possibly a discussion can bring out some of those groups. In this period of development, there was still a focal point in New York City, but it very quickly developed in other places, contact improvisation. A couple of those places in Canada were Vancouver and Montreal. Came to Toronto a little bit later. And I want to talk about it because it's a form, in its form, how it's practiced and how it's been passed on was very much influenced by the spirit of fighting for liberty and more democracy from the 1960s and 70s. And it's an example of how much what was going on in broader society affected the art and the artists at the time. So contact as a form was developed by modern dancer and militant improviser Steve Paxton in 1972 in a modern dance class for men at Oberlin College, something kind of unusual. And then he took it to New York City with some Oberlin enthusiasts in tow, and they started developing the form. Contact is based on the dynamic use of gravity and momentum and the physical connection between dancers, so they're physically in contact, and they do a lot of sort of very almost acrobatic movement, and of course it's all improvised. And the form is quite unique in that it's incredibly easy to learn. It's really just based on basic physics that we know, lifting, pulling, sitting, but expanded and developed a little bit. So you can learn it quickly. It's a very social form because obviously you're actually working with other people and it's done in a social way. It's very gender neutral. Women lift men, men lift women. And it quickly developed an audience, people who wanted to learn it. And although the form is really incredibly dynamic with people flying through the air, it is never presented as spectacle. It's always presented as casual virtuosity. Early performances were very low tech, no costumes, lights, set, music, etc. One concert series was billed, you come, we'll show you what we do. So a very casual approach to performance with as little distance between the audience and the performer as possible. And there was a critical moment when the form was becoming popular that there was a decision made by the originators not to create a system or a vocabulary or a school or a hierarchy for this form. And this decision in a sort of period of egalitarianism, their idea was that they wanted to leave the integrity of the form in the hands of the people who were actually using it and not give somebody authority over the form. So it was sort of an experiment in radical democracy within an art form. The originators wanted to reduce the distinction between the beginner and the experienced, that sort of hierarchy inside of the art form, and they wanted to encourage the existence of the form both in the community as well as in the art world. And contact is practiced in very inclusive community-based events called jams, where people of all levels of experience, multi-generational, differently abled communities can mix together. And there is no doubt that this inclusiveness has contributed to the phenomenally fast spread of this form. In 36 years, it's on every single continent. And the integrity of the form, without any codified technique, is really remarkable. A dancer could go from Hong Kong to Australia to Canada and slide comfortably into a contact jam. So it's quite amazing. Aesthetically, contact has influenced Western art dance significantly with a movement dynamic that engages gravity and momentum. It's made its mark on the art world, but it has remained a community form accessible to anyone. And so I just want to conclude thinking about art. It seems to me that it functions as a site of a particular kind of tension in human society. On the one hand, you have this liberal notion of the primacy of the individual and the importance of personal expression, and kind of suggests that it's our existence as separate beings that is our most sort of important concern as humans. And artists have been criticized for participating in the political realm based on the idea that their concern is only with the realm of individual expression. And on the other hand, the other tension is the idea that art is a reflection of society and therefore sort of wholly bound up in what humans do collectively. At times of increased political tension, artists feel the dynamic of that tension and they reflect it in their art, sometimes very consciously, like the people I spoke about today in the periods of art, Isadora Duncan, the revolution dancers of the 30s, the contactors. And I would say that I would hope for the dancers of today, looking at these times and seeing also this period of increased political tension, that we would be inspired by these political leaders of the past to actually choose to consciously engage in the political struggles of today and reflect it in our art. So we're just going to have a brief discussion, and certainly comments we can have on the floor, but I'm also here to ask questions or bounce comments off.
That was beautiful. But I could see the revolution like in that whole dance. I don't know, I just find, because I love watching dancing, I love watching interpretive dancing, so just, I mean, I like to dance as well, but I find it's just seeing the revolution in all of them, I guess at that period and that time. Yeah.
Let's have a quick comment.
Just like we were speaking about Isadora Duncan and Martha Graham, I got a little confused. Like, did Isadora Duncan like work under Martha Graham, or were they both choreographers? Like, I wasn't sure what.
Isadora preceded Martha Graham.
Oh, okay.
She was working from about 1900 to her death in 1927, and Martha Graham started in the early to mid-20s.
Oh, okay.
So
right.
Martha Graham was influenced
By it.
I'm not sure that I don't think they knew each other.
Right.
Any comments? Anybody? Seems to be a questions.
Just to follow up on that, to clarify, so Martha Graham, she was Isadora Duncan was criticized for her stance, but Martha Graham was not, and I didn't quite catch, like, she was still doing something that was sort of radical and new, but was it because she was dealing with topics that were sort of approved topics that she didn't get criticized as well, or?
Yeah, the content of her work was not specifically political. I mean, I think it maybe people could have interpreted it that way, but she certainly didn't. And although there was a time in the 30s when she was pulled in because there were so many, it's hard to imagine the 1930s, because there were so many people who actually were politicized in that period, and the artist community, lots of people were pulled into very specific relationship to the struggle, making political art, being involved in political struggles. But she was not, and she didn't actually support some of the dancers who were in her company, who were some of the revolutionary artists. She didn't go to their shows, or she wasn't interested in that. She had a different idea about what art was, that it was more about the personal, and the content was definitely more about the personal. So, when the government was trying to sort of discredit social realism and agitprop art that criticized the system, they kind of chose her and sort of lifted her up in the eyes of in the art world too, because they found that she was able to have more exposure.
I think probably, it's not fair to say that she wasn't criticized. I'm sure she was criticized quite a bit because of the modernism of her dance style. It's just on that political level. I think by the time she was taken under the wing of the officialdom, she was probably already relatively well established by that point. So it's not like she was being supported from the beginning while other people weren't.
No.
She was creating her own revolution, and to this day modern dance is hard to watch. I mean, it's not an easy form to watch, which is why you don't see it on So You Think You Can Dance. You see contemporary, but you don't see modern. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
The angularity and that kind of stuff.